Apple is known for being very petty, especially when it comes to lawsuits. In 2020, Apple tried suing a tiny meal prepping app called Prepare because they deemed their logo of a pear as being too similar to the Apple logo, and demanded the small team of 5 people to remove the logo completely. And this isn't anything new. Another case, in 2012, involved Apple using a famous Swiss railway clock design for the clock app of iOS 6 without any permission, which was popular since 1944. Seeing how protective Apple was of their own designs, this felt very petty, and Apple ended up quietly paying a $21 million license to use the design after being called out. As with every large company, the problem is that it's nearly impossible to fight against them legally. The Prepare case only worked against Apple's favor because it became super trendy and because it was a clear move of power and was just unreasonable, but there are countless lesser-known lawsuits where Apple automatically wins due to their sheer size and resources, even ones that may have been unfair. However, when Apple tries clashing with a company of its own size, and one that is arguably the biggest in the gaming sphere, things get a lot more interesting. As you probably know, Epic Games didn't create Fortnite as a big battle royale game, but rather a base-building survival game. This was teased all the way back in 2011 and was released 6 years later with modest success, but nothing too revolutionary. But in September of that same year, Epic Games saw the success of PUBG and rapidly developed a mode which they called Fortnite Battle Royale, which used everything the original game had, but simply in a PvP Battle Royale setting. While the original Fortnite cost money, Epic Games had to rebrand the entire game to be free from the get-go and to include the original zombie fighting mode as an extra campaign, which cost around the same amount as Fortnite did at the start. Epic, seeing all the potential, put all the focus into developing this new Battle Royale mode, and with the unique art style, building mechanics, and the fact that the game was now free to play, Fortnite began growing rapidly, starting 2018 with over 45 million registered players. This is where Epic Games made the decision to create an iOS mobile port for Fortnite. However, they did this in a very interesting way in order to maximize the reach and profit they believed Fortnite could get. In March of 2018, Epic launched Fortnite iOS for the first time with an invite-only beta. While the game was technically already ready, this helped Fortnite build massive hype as every single person begged to get a code to play the game. This was also huge for Fortnite content creators, as everyone wanted to see videos of them playing mobile Fortnite, as well as participate in the many code giveaways that would occur. By doing this, Epic was able to build massive hype and make Fortnite seem exclusive and elite, even though it was a free app, giving many people a real fear of missing out, which just pushed the hype even further. Because of this, Fortnite hit the #1 spot in 13 countries within 24 hours on the App Store. Epic Games took their mobile app very seriously, giving it as much attention as they gave to the original. They updated and optimized the Unreal Engine 4 to run Fortnite smoothly on older devices like the iPhone 6 and iPad Air 2. This let Fortnite have console-quality graphics, 60 FPS support on the iPhone X, and the full PC map as opposed to some cut-down, low-quality mobile version. Fortnite Mobile would also come with built-in voice chat and supported Bluetooth controllers, something most mobile shooters didn't support at the time. Despite being still in beta, Fortnite Mobile ended up making $1 million in just the first 72 hours. It would launch publicly just 17 days later in April 2nd, and end up earning over $100 million within 90 days, which made it the fastest growing mobile game of the time. If you remember, I previously stated that this was an iOS version of Fortnite, but what about Android? Epic actually did something crazy and completely avoided the Google Play Store, encouraging Android users to instead download the APK file directly from Epic's website. Their reasoning for this was to avoid the 30% cut that Google would take from every microtransaction, an issue Epic Games would end up having again in the future. However, not having an official Fortnite app meant that many malicious clones began popping up on the Play Store that masqueraded Fortnite and began scamming players. Epic didn't want to deal with the image issues and potential lawsuits and ended up reluctantly adding the mobile port to the Play Store in April 2020. This put Fortnite into a very unfavorable spot. Epic Games didn't like being restricted by the fact that 30% of their income was going to both Apple and Google, especially since that income was needed to continue funding the game. And so in August of 2020, just 4 months after Fortnite was added to the Play Store, Epic Games decided to directly challenge both Apple and Google. Epic pushed an update for both the iOS and Android versions of Fortnite with a direct payment option, which bypassed the in-app purchase system of both platforms. While players could still choose their payment method, Epic gave direct purchases a slight discount, which made it just an obvious choice for pretty much every single player, and also made Apple look greedy for charging more money. Apple responded by removing Fortnite from the App Store for violating their guidelines in the same day, with Google also removing it from their Play Store shortly after. Epic immediately launched a lawsuit against Apple, accusing them of their anti-competitive practices and monopolistic behavior, and also released a parody ad called 1980 Fortnite, which mimicked Apple's 1984 commercial to portray Apple as an oppressor. An interesting fact is that this ad was actually published to YouTube in August 13th of 2020, which was the same day that they added the direct payment option to Fortnite, implying they knew what would happen, and all of this was just a strategy to fight Apple back in the lawsuit. Epic's accusations were that Apple has a monopoly over the iOS app distribution and in-app payments, that developers are forced to use Apple's payment system without even being able to tell users about alternatives, something Epic considered to be anti-competitive and therefore illegal. Epic's point wasn't that they're doing this for money, even though that was their personal reason, but that Apple makes up a giant portion of the mobile market and holds way too much power over that market and forces iOS to be strictly Apple only. Epic wanted the court to force Apple to open up iOS to competing app stores and payment systems, and believed this was a reasonable claim to sue Apple over. Apple's defense was that Epic broke a contract. Every Apple developer signs an agreement to follow App Store rules, which Epic knew and violated on purpose to start the lawsuit. They argue that their App Store isn't a monopoly, as users can always switch to Android and web apps, which work just the same and already have massive user bases. And then lastly, Apple deemed the App Store to be a service which is well within their legal right to charge whatever they want for it, and that the 30% commission funds the complex privacy, security, and content moderation systems for a marketplace that serves over 1 billion iPhones. Effectively, Apple claimed that Epic is trying to make rules for a platform they did not build, and that this platform deserves the right to be ran however Apple sees fit. The trial began officially in May 2021, reaching federal court in California with Judge Wyon Gonzalez Rogers presiding. Over 3 weeks, top executives of both companies testified for their claims, including Tim Sweeney from Epic Games and Phil Schiller from Apple. Among the aspects covered by the trial, Epic and Apple discussed whether other apps such as Minecraft and Roblox should be defined as games or metaverses. While both agreed that Minecraft is a game, they disagreed over the proper way to define Roblox. Epic argued that Roblox is a metaverse that contains various games, similar to Fortnite, while Apple argued that Roblox is a singular game that simply contains user-created experience, similar to servers in Minecraft. An interesting fact is that this is the reason for Roblox rebranding their games to now be called experiences. Seeing a clear disagreement in their definitions, they moved on to the more relevant aspects. Apple defended its strict App Store content rules, a restriction that previously would prevent cloud gaming services like GeForce Now from offering an app on the App Store, as each game would require direct approval by Apple. Apple pointed out the addition of itch.io, an indie game storefront, to the Epic Games Store, stating that as itch.io lacked any moderation of content, this allowed the Epic Games Store to effectively contain a large amount of mature content, which went against Epic's own store guidelines. Apple argued that to upkeep and respect their own guidelines, they need to have access over everything that happens within their own platform, and that users are still able to access any service, such as GeForce, through a web browser like Google. Epic's defense was that they simply distribute the itch.io client, and were not responsible for the games that came from that client, just as Apple wouldn't be responsible for mature content accessed from Safari. And lastly, Apple's anti-steering policies, which prevent any app from directing its users to an external purchase method, were brought into question. Anti-steering is not actually illegal so long as no harm was shown to either Apple or whatever external store the developers tried directing their users to. Epic argued that by blocking these external stores, Apple harms them by blocking off a giant cut of profits, while Apple stated that this is simply due to their size as a company and not some malicious direct intent to harm competitors. Judge Rogers issued her first verdict in September of 2021. She claimed that Epic's core argument was false and that Apple does not classify as a monopoly under US law, and that it doesn't control the smartphone market overall. This meant that Apple was fully within legal right to remove Fortnite due to their rules, and Epic was required to pay Apple $3.6 million, which was the revenue Apple would have gotten had Epic not added a direct payment option. Alongside that, she further stated that since Epic did violate its contract as a developer from Apple, they can't legally do anything about Fortnite Mobile being removed from the App Store. However, Apple was ordered to remove their anti-steering rules and allow developers to tell users about alternative payment methods, which allowed big brands such as Supercell to finally push for their own payment methods to their players. From 2021 to 2023, the appeals begin. Epic appeals in hopes of overturning the ruling of Apple not being a monopoly, and Apple appeals to keep the anti-steering rules in place, and the case is moved to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. In 2023, after 2 years of the case bouncing back and forth, with both sides arguing over repetitive topics such as the definition of monopoly, the Ninth Circuit Court ended up upholding the original decision made by Judge Rogers. In the first month of 2024, both Apple and Epic tried to bring their case to the US Supreme Court, as neither were happy with the decision made by Judge Rogers and the Ninth Circuit Court. The Supreme Court, however, declined to hear either appeal. So Apple, being forced to comply and allow external links, decided to introduce a new petty policy. While developers will be allowed to link to outside payment systems, Apple would still charge a 27% commission on any purchases made this way, as well as place design restrictions on how these links appear and give warnings to intentionally scare users that the links may lead to an unsafe website. This petty compliance made Judge Rogers rule that this violates the original purpose of her decision, and that the 27% fee exists to still punish developers for using alternatives. This marked the first time ever Apple was formally found to be in defiance of a federal court order, and Rogers extended her injunctions to prevent Apple from having guidelines that prevented developers from making any sort of alternative income other than the App Store payouts. With this new ruling, Tim Sweeney, the CEO of Epic Games, filed a final message to the district courts to force Apple to approve Fortnite after over 2 weeks of submitting the game to the App Store with no response. And finally, on March 19, 2025, Apple approved Fortnite, stating that all the issues with its submission to the App Store have been resolved, and Fortnite came back to the App Store a day later on May 20th. While Fortnite is currently back on the iOS market, many people believe Apple will continue trying to put itself in between users and developers as much as possible in the future. Companies are starting to send as much of their user base to their own payment methods as possible while they still can, with the giants like Supercell starting to market their own store and rewarding those who buy from it with exclusive cosmetics. But in the meantime, after 1,750 days of absence, Fortnite is back on the market. Now we just have to see what the returning players will think about seeing Hatsune Miku in their lobbies.